Between 1837 and 1901, England was ruled by Queen Victoria, who dictated what was acceptable while mourning.
Although people today can mourn the way they believe is acceptable for the person that died, in the Victorian era, funeral customs were influenced by society's way of thinking because of the proper etiquette of mourning and being respected in the Victorian society.
The mourning process would differ depending on age, gender, and social class of the passing person. If you were a child, you would only be mourned for 6 months than if you were an adult, where you would be mourned for at least a year.
Women played a key role in caring for the sick and dying, and were responsible for laying out the corpse for burials, while men didn't have to prepare because it was seen as a woman's duty.
While women had to buy lavish mourning clothes and wear them for long periods of time, men had it easy. They simply wore their usual dark suits along with black gloves, hatbands, and cravats.
If you were rich, people knew you died, and most of the town would be invited to your funeral. Wealthy families were able to provide black mourning clothes to the invited mourners, including servants and dependents. If you were poor, no one knew you died and were buried in an unmarked grave.
Poor people could not afford to buy new funeral clothes, but wealthy people could, which kept the funeral shops open. If you were poor, you usually rented or traded your everyday clothes for mourning clothes.
After the loss of her husband, the Queen went into deep mourning, and British subjects followed her lead, making death practices become more elaborate. She set most of the standards of how to mourn by example.
In England, their funeral practices have been changed to the ruler of today, who is Queen Elizabeth II, and her funeral practices over the years have eased up. Now, they are closer to other countries who just wear black.
When you were allowed to stop mourning depended on the relationship to the deceased. Women mourned for their husbands for at least 2 years.
Siblings were mourned for at least 6 months. Regulations on the proper mourning was very strict, and if you didn't follow it, you were seen as disrespectful.
Grandparents were mourned for 3 months, and mourners wore simple black with a touch of crepe. The more distant of a relative it was, the less you mourned for them, no matter how close you were to them or not.
Cousins were mourned for 6 weeks. 3 of those weeks were half mourning, which was seen as a very short period of time during the Victorian era. Where you got buried was a key factor in Victorian funerals. The body was left in the house for a wake so they could watch it. During that time, many people believed that they might not be dead but just in a coma and may wake up.
Indians would leave the dead on trails during travels. They wouldn't stop to bury their dead in fear of catching white man's disease. They were not as strict as the English and believed in more of an afterlife than the body on earth. Many Indians couldn't bury their dead because of white man's fever that
Romans believed that people were here to serve and afterlife didn't really matter. Their dead bodies were buried left and right by Protestant priests. Roman society didn't have as much of an impact in what was acceptable mourning.
In the United States, they buried their dead in cemeteries or in mass common graves during the plague. Unlike the Victorian era, people in the United States mourned with flowers, which was rare in England society.
Curtains would be drawn and clocks would be stopped at the time of death. People of the Victorian era believed in lots of superstitions, making them paranoid about their own death, causing them to follow every ritual. Many Victorians believed that mirrors held special powers in relation to the spirit. They thought it was necessary to cover all mirrors in the home with heavy black cloth to prevent the spirit of the deceased from becoming trapped in the mirror.
They prepared the dead bodies with care. The children's deceased bodies were prepared as if they were still alive. They would be dressed up and standing inside of an upright casket.
Small cakes known as funeral biscuits were wrapped in white paper and sealed with black sealing wax and given to guests as favors. Lavish meals or collations were often served after interment. The rich gave alms to the poor when someone died, and also many were invited to the celebration, depending on their wealth.
Society dictated what was the acceptable way to mourn for someone. Should be taught that society will not respect her unless she pays memory to the man whose name she bears. Although Victorian families wanted to mourn in their own way, they must publicly mourn for the respectful amount of time and in the appropriate dress.
Many Victorians would follow the rules because they didn't want bad luck and they wanted security in their own afterlife, also to prevent superstitions from coming true.
If you smell roses when no one is around, someone is going to die.
If you hear a clap of thunder following a burial, it indicates that the soul of the departed has reached heaven.
If you don't hold your breath while going by a graveyard, you will not be buried.
In the Victorian era, there were grave robbers who called themselves the resurrectionist men. Often doctors were the problem in the 19th century, as medical schools needed fresh cadavers for dissection classes.
Breaking over a grave was a way of guaranteeing some security after death. People mostly did this to keep out robbers from stealing their jewelry that had been buried with them. Bodies were buried with their heads to the west and their feet to the east because of Christians who believed that the final summons to judgment will come from the east.
Although mourning is looked upon less socially than in the Victorian era now, the superstitions and rituals of their day were seen as normal. They were influenced by society's proper etiquette of mourning, and in order to be accepted into society, you had to follow their rules. Because of women being suppressed in this time, they became a backbone in caring for the deceased. Social class decided where you were buried and how you were treated while dead.
Fear of a loved one being buried alive inspired coffin makers to design warning systems such as a bell in the grave, which was connected by a chain to the inside of the coffin in cases of premature burial. This is where the phrase "saved by the bell" came from.